Hello students. Today we're going to be talking about MEC 9, the lab about moment of inertia and rigid body, and this is part of the elementary lab for first year students offered by Department of Physics and Material Science, Chiang Mai University. So first of all, when you talk about the rigid body, you want to talk about like an upgrade from the point mass. So from your high school, you have learned a lot about the point mass, which is actually described by the law, Newton's law of motion. And when you have a bunch of point mass attached together and you get a solid body, so this is what you call a rigid body. So a rigid body is a solid body. That means it's no longer a point mass. It may have a center of mass, and also it has like every single mass distribution out there that is forming this figure. And it must have zero deformation. So if I press it anywhere, a rigid body should not shrink, move, or tilt it at all. So basically, when I talk about like a really strong figure that actually has a dimension, that's when we're talking about rigid body. So when I pick a point, say the eye and the chest, basically at any given 2 points that I list up there, maybe the eye versus the chest or the elbow versus the chest or anywhere, if you rotate this image around, the location between the 2 points have to be displaced like at a constant displacement. So usually when you talk about the rotation, whenever you have a rigid body, you would actually have what you call the rotational energy, which is not present in the case of a point mass. But when you have the body that could be rotated around, then you would have the rotational energy, which is strongly associated with the moment of inertia, which is essentially the mass of a rotating rigid body. So it's the inertia in terms of the rotational sense. So what is a moment of inertia? So moment of inertia is basically the mass term for a rotation, which can be used to describe torque equal I alpha, which is the Newton's law of motion equivalent of the rotational frame. And you can actually calculate it through Regulus models, which is completely described as shown in a figure. So for example, if you have a point mass situated at a radius r1 from the center, and another mass m2 that is situated r2 away from the center, the total moment of inertia of this guy is basically the sum of the two objects, so mr squared plus mr squared. And this moment of inertia also depends on the geometry and where you rotate it. For example, a disk would actually have 1/2 mr squared if the r is the radius of the disk and m is the mass of the disk. And if you rotate it along another axis, then it would actually have a different moment of inertia, which all of these can be proved through integrals. But then again, we're not doing integrals here, we're doing lab, so we're not going to talk about derivation. But you can think of moment of inertia as given as this equation, I equals gamma mr squared, where gamma is a geometrical factor depending on where you're looking at it. So for example, for a point mass at distance r, gamma is 1. For a disk that's being rotated around its center of mass, the gamma is 1/2. And if you're rotating on this axis, the gamma is 1/4. And this geometrical factor is unitless. And m is the mass of the system, and r is the radius or any length scale described in the system as shown in this figure here. So when you found an object that's considered a rigid body, you can actually find a moment of inertia associated with such object. So the unit of I is naturally mass time radius square, so it's basically kilogram meter square. Okay, gamma has no unit. All right, when you talk about rotational oscillation, so all of you are somewhat familiar with the spring mass system. Basically, a spring mass system would actually have restoring force that is equal negative kx. So basically, if you put this guy in equivalent to the Newton's law of motion, you would have F equals m d2x by dt squared. And from these two equations, you can sort of prove that the angular frequency is square root k over m. So in this case, we would have a spring, but the spring is actually a rotational spring, so we have a spiral spring mass system. So this mass is situated on the axis of rotation, and it is attached to like a curly spring mass, which will be shown through the experimental part of this demonstration. So, in the angular spring mass system, it's a similar thing, but instead of force, you replace it with the torque that is used to calculate it, and it would actually have a spring constant of d, and this d is basically the torsional constant that we'll be figuring out on the first part of the lab. And instead of the equation of motion given by Newton's law of motion, you would actually have torque equals I alpha, which I described earlier, and I is literally the moment of inertia of the system, which is the subject of study. So this guy is a rigid body with moment of inertia. So by plugging that in, you would actually have the omega equals square root d divided by I, similar to the way you derive the things in the spring mass system. So right now, you would actually have the spring constant divided by the inertia of the system. So basically, the mass of the rotational term, aka moment of inertia. All right. So we have this equation of momentum inertia and spring constant being convoluted in terms of the angular frequency. So omega equals square root d divided by I. But since we know that omega is basically 2 pi divided by t, where t is the period. So if omega is 2 pi divided by t, and we do the measurement of this guy by rotating this spring a little bit, it would actually start rotating back and forth. You will see it in the experimental part, but once you flip this around, it would rotate back and forth because the spring would provide restoring torque. So then you count the period, basically the time it takes for it to finish a rotation, and you would be able to calculate t equals 2 pi multiplied by square root I divided by d, or conversely, if you want to find the I, or the moment of inertia of the system based on what period you found, you can actually rotate this equation around by putting 2 pi on the other side, take square on both sides, and then move d on the other side, then you would have this equation. So this is the main equation that I'll be talking about today, about how to find the moment of inertia of a system based on the period of these oscillation. Part 1 of the experiment. You're going to be having to find the torsion constant of the spiral spring. So the question is, when you talk about the spiral spring, you want to attach an object with the moment of inertia on top of it, and then you want to figure out what is the torsional spring constant. So the torsional spring constant is defined by the torque which is exerted at a given angle, right? So what you want to do is you want to hang a mass to get a constant force that you want to figure out, and then before doing that, you want to tie the rope onto the left side of this spring, and then let the mass hang. And as the mass hang, it would exert torque such that this rod would be flipped 180 degree. So once it's flipped 180 degree, then you would actually have a mass hanging down here. Okay, so this flip of 180 degree is basically the angle or the angular displacement that is yielded from this torque that is given by the mass. So you can actually find that torque is Rf sine theta. And since the angle theta is the angle between the force and the center point of the rotation, so basically this displacement would give you a 90 degree, allowing the sine theta to be 1. And then since torque is also d times angular displacement, and angular displacement is 180 degrees. 180 degrees mean pi, so d times pi is torque equals r times f. And since the f is the weight of the mass being hung here, so you can say that f equals mg, and then plug this in here. So from there, you could actually extract d from r mg divided by pi, all of which can be measured, okay? So on the first part, you will be using this apparatus in order to figure out what is the torsional constant of this coil spring. So the tools that we're going to have is this little setup of the coil spring and a rod mass attached to it, And this little coil spring is actually spiraled towards the center, and at the center is where the torque is being applied to the rod. And then you're gonna need a string in order to hang a mass to provide a torque for it to spin, and you're gonna have a mass hanger and a couple mass pieces to hang it together to form this experiment. So as you know, this hanger is gonna have its little weight, so be sure to record it. Usually it's 40-50 grams, so be sure to look into it. It's written down below there. And what you want to do is you want to hang the mass so that the rod twisted 180 degree, like the demonstration show. So first of all, you want to rotate the rod 120 degree, and then hang it at the farmost part of the rod. Let it twist a little bit, and then to apply the torque, you want to hang it over the pulley and put the mass on. So first, set it nicely and tightly wound to the pulley, down to the pulley, and then you put the mass onto it and start adding more mass until it's sitting there with a 90 degrees angle between the force and the little radius here. As you can see, as the instructor releases the mass a little bit, you can see that the rod actually swings backward a little bit. What you want to do is you want to find the equilibrium. But then again, right here, as you can see, the mass is a little too light because the rod is twisted backward a little bit, so the angle that it was twisted is not 180 degree or the pi that we put into the equation. So one way to figure out is use an object that is like a 90 degree, like for example the box. Put the box cover to make sure that it's 90 degree. You can add or decrease the mass that is being hung down there to adjust the torque that is being applied to the system. And from there, you can actually get nice 90 degree setup as is demonstrated here. And once you're done, you want to record the mass in order to calculate what is the D for that. And as you progress on, you want to change the radius. So each time you adjust the radius, you can reduce it to the node where it's actually engraved onto the rod. It might be hard to see here, but you can see it on the actual experiment. And each time you do that, you want to reposition the center of the spring and also readjust the mass that is needed to hang. So again, you want a 90 degree angle between the force that's being applied to the spring. And naturally, as you go further towards the center, as the radius is being reduced, to provide the same torque, you would, as you would imagine, need more forces. So in turns, you have to hang more mass on top of the spring in order to provide the same value of the torque. So as you adjust this radius, you want to keep increasing the torque until you run out of the groove that you could actually wind the string onto it. And be sure to record the number or the total mass of what's being applied down there and multiply it by g in order to calculate the mg as given in the equation according to what I gave to you earlier. And this is about it for the first part. So here we go. We're gonna start moving on to the next part. Again, you want to keep the angle, the twisted angle, as 180 degree and form a nice 90 degree angle with the force being applied. Second part of the experiment. Once you know D, you're going to be finding the ICM of an object. So in this case, you're going to be finding the I prime CM based on the instruction given. So first of all, you want to measure the weight of the mass M1 and M2, and then hang it at different spot on top of these rotational axis. So what you want to do is, since you know that the total moment of inertia of a system can be given by the addition of the moment of inertia of each subsystem. So basically m1 plus m2 r squared plus I prime cm. So I prime cm is the center of mass of this little rod here, and m1 plus m2 r squared is basically the moment of inertia attributed from these two masses. So these two masses, you're going to be, at the beginning of the lab, measure the mass of these guys, and then you're going to be putting these guys at a fixed spot from the pivot point. And from there, you're going to be doing a series of measurement to figure out what is I prime Cm. And ICM is basically what you can be found from this equation. So once you attach the mass on it, you're going to be disturbing the system by a little bit and let it oscillate. And this oscillation, like I said, you can be measuring the period of the oscillation. And since from part 1 you've already known the torsional constant here, and 4 pi square is a constant, so basically from there you could use the t squared, d, and 4 pi square to calculate what is the ICM. Okay, so by changing different r, you would get different ICM. So what you want to do is you want to make a series of ICM based on different r. So adjusting these guys and doing a bunch of oscillations, repeat it over and over, change the distance here based on what's given in your lab manual. And then you're going to have a plot between ICM and r square. So from this equation, you would know that the ICM versus r squares, the slope there is going to give you m1 plus m2, and the y-intercept is gonna be I prime Cm. So make a plot, find the y-intercept, and then that's how you figure out the ICM, which is the object of this work. Okay. All right. So once you found the I prime Cm, then you can move on to the next part. So here's the setup for the second part. Now that you have known that the parts that are being put together are going to be the spiral coil spring and the rod that's going to be attached on it. So first of all, you want to figure out what's the mass of that rod that's being questioned. So the rod is going to be attached with 2 smaller masses right there, as described in your lab notebook. So first of all, what you want to know is what are the masses of the rods and the little masses. Before doing anything, be sure to measure the length of the total length of the rod, and then you're gonna be putting the rod onto the scale. And this is a traditional scale. It's like you're gonna have to balance both sides of the scale by adjusting the total value of the hang mass on the right side with the mass that is being put on to the scale on the left side. So be sure to adjust the coarse adjustment, then the medium adjustment, then the fine adjustment. And once you have measured the mass when the scale is already balanced, then you can put the smaller mass, each one of them one by one, and then redo the scale. And pay attention, you're going to be adjusting the largest one first, and then smaller one, and the smallest one for fine adjustment. And the measurement is done whenever the scale is sitting at the center right there. Okay, so this is when you can read the mass. So read the total mass and do the same thing for the other mass. You can start where you left off and do the fine adjustment because the two masses are quite similar in mass. And once you have figured out the mass of each of them, record the mass of M1 and M2 according to the lab manual, and then you are good to go with sticking the rod into the system. So stick the rod in all the way through, just like it was set up on part 1 that you use to figure out D. And once you stick the rod all the way through, tighten it down by tightening the screw up there on the top. And then once the rod is set up tightly on top of the spring, then you could actually add the two masses onto both sides. So be sure to tighten the spring and keep it balanced to get the best result. And first of all, you want to start from the most outside part. So again, you can use the same groove that you use on the first part to tie the string. Instead of tightening the string this time, you put the mass on it. Okay, and once the mass is put in, we have developed a theory about the relationship between the period and moment of inertia and the D of the spring. Since we have figured out the D of the spring from the first part, you want to twist it for around 180 degrees. Focus on one mass, and then you want to time what is the period of this oscillation. So now we release the mass and it's gonna rotate around the center. So first of all, you want to make sure you know which mass you want to pay attention to count the period. So for example, right now I'm tracking one mass. So 1, to track one oscillation, you want to make sure it moves from one side all the way to another. So right there, all the way back, okay? And that's one period. So all the way in, then all the way back, that's another period, okay? So record the time it takes, and then you can adjust the mass length and redo the experiment all over again. So once you repeated that part, you just redo the measurement of the period, and once you have the period of each different R, then you could calculate the ICM based on the equation that you could use the period in order to calculate the ICM, and you make a plot between ICM at different R that you have done here, and from there, with the plot, you can get the y-intercept in order to find the ICM prime, which is essentially the ICM of the rod alone without the masses that is being hung around out there. And that's pretty much the second part. Okay, third part is the last one. So we have the parallel axis theorem. So basically, you know that the moment of inertia of a disk is given by 1/2 mr squared, but say that you move the rotational axis away from the center of mass. There's a parallel axis theorem. So this axis is parallel to that guy. So the parallel axis theorem said, instead, if I were to move the rotational point to point P, which is away from the center of mass by distance d, then the new moment of inertia is given by the sum of the moment of inertia from the center of mass, which is 1/2 mr squared, plus md squared, where d is the displacement between these two spots. So your job here is to prove the parallel axis theorem. So what do? Again, you're going to be disturbing this rod by moving it, rotating it around on top of the spiral spring, which is going to be shown in the experimental part in a little bit. And then from this equation, again, you can calculate the I0 based on how far you displace the D. So, and then you plug this guy into the I0. So you would actually be able to calculate the relation between this theory with the t square. So what you want to do generally is make a plot between the t square and the d square based on this equation. Basically, I just plug this guy into I0 and rearrange terms a little bit. You get this equation. And from this equation, make a plot between t square and d square and find out the slope of the graph to figure out the mass of the disk. Okay, so what you want to find here on the final part is finding the slope, and then use that slope to find this mass, and then compare it to whatever number is written on the disk. All right, okay, that will be all for now. All right, so here are the experimental setup of the third part about the parallel axis theorem on the rotating disk. So right here we have the same old spring with the rod removed, and we're going to be doing our measurements on these little plate right here. And at the bottom of the plate, it would have the number that's written in there. Find the center. And as you move away from the center, you can start testing the parallel axis theorem. So the left and right distance are slightly different, so be sure to use both of them as you do the measurement. From here, at the center, you're going to be first placing the disc on top of the coil spring in order to do the rotation and start doing the measurement to find the I using the same trick we've learned from earlier. So this disc would actually have the moment of inertia, and to find that moment of inertia, you want to attach a few things here. So before doing anything, be sure to measure the radius of the disc, because the disc would actually have the moment of inertia equals 1/2 mr squared, and the mass is written in there. So what you want to do is to measure the radius first, and once you've done that, you want to attach the holder on top of the spring coil. So this would make sure that the disc is actually situated and fixated on top of the spring coil. And once you position it in whatever radius that you want, stick the screw in and tighten it just like the first part to make sure that the disc is nicely sitting down there. So once you have the disc situated correctly, what you want to do is similar to what you did last time. So you want to rotate the disc around a little bit in order to create it some angular momentum and create the oscillation. So first of all, rotate the disc a little bit, maybe around 180 degree. So that's not a little bit. So rotate it around 180 degree and then release it. Again, you want a time for the period because the period is what you use to calculate the moment of inertia. So again, watch for the disc to repeat its motion and count carefully. So you see, this is when it makes its full rotation, forward, backward, one period, forward, backward, another two period. Okay, forward, backward. So basically be sure to let the disc spin all the way through and then count the period correctly. And from there, once you've done one distance, you want to remove the screw and then readjust the position of the disc. Once the disc is repositioned, you could test the parallel axis theorem because the parallel axis theorem says if you change the axis of rotation away from the center of mass, then it would actually have the additional md square added onto that. And with it, you could be expecting a higher period because there's a higher moment of inertia, for example, like this. So keep changing the distance and then record the period to figure out what is the moment of inertia in each part, and then make the plot accordingly. And yeah, that's about it for the third part. So you just rinse and repeat, and be sure to measure the time correctly for each period. So as you can see, once the disk is moving further away from the center of mass, so the rotation point would actually make effectively higher moment of inertia according to the parallel axis theorem, which you will be proving with your plot of t squared versus the d squared. All right? Okay, so yeah, that's about it for this part.